The South China Sea is about to become the most dangerous stretch of water on Earth. As China's naval ambitions grow bolder by the day, it's building artificial islands with military installations, and its newest carrier is prowling disputed waters. But the US Navy hasn't been sleeping. In fact, they've been doing anything but that. The US has been quietly developing 5 revolutionary weapon systems that could solidify the balance of power in the Pacific for the next century. These aren't your traditional weapons or seagoing vessels. They're entire systems and protocols designed for a new kind of warfare, one where hypersonic missiles scream across the horizon, drone swarms cover the sky, and electronic jamming threatens to disable targeting systems for hundreds of miles. Each one addresses a specific vulnerability in America's Pacific defense strategy that China had hoped to exploit. So while China has focused on carrier counts and submarine numbers, the US has been developing 5 systems that rewrite the rules of naval combat in ways that render traditional metrics almost meaningless. Let's dive into the arsenal that keeps Chinese military planners up at night. First, it's the AIM-174B gunslinger. At nearly 15 feet long and weighing 1,900 pounds, this isn't just another air-to-air missile. It's a flying smart machine that has a reach of over 300 miles and can practically annihilate any aircraft or missile it touches. That's 3 times the range of the already legendary AIM-54 Phoenix missile that once adorned F-14 Tomcats. And it means FA-18 Super Hornets can now engage Chinese fighters before the latter even learn American aircraft are in the area. But even more importantly, the gunslinger is designed to be the first line of defense against supersonic missiles far away from the US military installations. The development of this weapon represents one of the Navy's most clever adaptations in decades, heralding the SM-6 Interceptor. The SM-6 surface-to-air missile had previously been protecting ships since 2013, but someone at Naval Air Systems Command had a radical idea. Why not hang it under a fighter jet? The engineering challenges were enormous. The SM-6 was specifically designed for destroyer and carrier launches, which gave a lot of leeway on size, speed and weight due to more bulky deployment systems that ships could use. The weight exceeded anything the Super Hornet had ever carried on a single hardpoint, as the Phoenix was 900 pounds lighter and 2 feet shorter. The aerodynamics of a 13.5-inch diameter missile flying at high altitude rather than being boosted from sea level also required a complete recalculation. To solve the weight issue, at least somewhat, the missile uses a sophisticated multi-mode seeker derived from the AMRAAM, but enlarged and enhanced with data link capabilities that let it receive targeting updates from any sensor in the network, such as ship radars, AWACS aircraft, or even satellite. A Super Hornet can then launch from beyond Chinese radar range, turn away immediately, and let the missile find its target using data from an E-2D Hawkeye orbiting 200 miles away. The Chinese never see the launching aircraft and never get a radar lock. They only have an incoming missile suddenly appearing on threat receivers, leaving them with seconds to react. The integration with existing Navy systems make this particularly potent. Every Aegis destroyer and cruiser in the fleet already operates SM-6 missiles and has the fire control systems to guide them. Now those same ships can provide targeting data to air launch versions, creating an integrated air-sea defense bubble that extends hundreds of miles in every direction. The Navy didn't need to develop new radars, new communication systems, or new training programs. They just adapted what they already had. But the real game changer arrived in June 2025, when the Missile Defense Agency published a solicitation for new wide area effect warheads specifically designed for the AIM-174B. The request specified warheads using novel defeat mechanisms against hypersonic threats, suggesting exotic technologies like directed fragmentation patterns or even electromagnetic pulse effect. These aren't just bigger explosions, they're specialized hypersonic killers designed to compensate for the extreme speeds and unpredictable maneuvers of China's most feared weapons. The program is moving at unprecedented speed. Initial operational capability of the missile itself was achieved in July 2024, just months after the first photos appeared of Super Hornets carrying the weapons. By September, they were deployed operationally with carrier air wings in the Pacific. The Navy plans to acquire 200 missiles throughout 2026. With production ramping up at Raytheon's Arizona facility that already builds SM-6 for the surface fleet. China can't easily counter this weapon, as its naval formations rely on layered air defenses with engagement ranges typically maxing out around 100 to 150 miles. Their longest range air-to-air missile, the PL-15, can reach perhaps 124 miles under ideal conditions. The AIM-174B outranges all of them, and more importantly, it doesn't need the launching aircraft's radar to guide it all the way to the target. Plus, the missile is ultimately designed as a deterrent rather than a strike missile, which adds more security for the US Navy to operate closer to Chinese waters and use its already extensive arsenal and fleet to best effect. And speaking of the fleet, the Navy's Virginia-class submarines are getting a much-needed weapons upgrade to make them punch faster, harder, and with little time for no response. We're talking about the CRAW, which stands for Compact Rapid Attack Weapon. It's an upgrade designed to make the subs fire faster and more frequently. To understand the significance of the next generation, let's rewind a bit. The Mark 48 torpedo itself contains nearly 5 decades of development that started with a simple proposition: what's needed to destroy a submarine reliably? During the Cold War, the answer was speed, stealth, and fire-and-forget functionality. The Mark 48 ended up being one of the smartest submarine launch weapons, with a warhead that had less than 700 pounds of explosives in a 3,000-pound casing. The onboard sonar and internal computers allow it to track its intended target, even going so as far to turn it around if it misses. But that wasn't really enough for modern weapon systems, as layered defenses and advanced maneuvering and jamming systems meant that torpedoes were getting less and less accurate. The solution is to utilize the same tried and tested strategy that's currently allowing Ukraine to hold off Russia: smaller weapons. The Mark 58 CRAW is the next generation, in development for over 20 years as the common, very lightweight torpedo, and initially conceived as an anti-torpedo defense system. The idea was that carriers and valuable ships could launch small interceptor torpedoes to destroy incoming threats. But the Navy quickly realized that if a 220-pound torpedo could catch and destroy another torpedo, it could certainly handle submarines and surface ships. The engineering breakthrough came from abandoning traditional torpedo design philosophy entirely. Heavy torpedoes like the Mark 48 are essentially underwater missiles built for long range and massive warheads. The CRAW takes the opposite approach. It's more like an underwater fighter jet, trading the extreme range and payload for maneuverability and numbers. Its 6.75-inch diameter is less than half of that of a Mark 48, but modern electronics and explosively formed penetrator warheads mean it can still hunt down submarines with impunity. But the Mark 58 itself is just part of the equation. If you used the same launching tubes that were used with the old design, you'd end up with a lot of wasted space. This is where the Revolver MP program comes in, which began testing in 2023. In theory, the redesign of the Revolver MP allows up to 10 CRAWs to fit into each torpedo tube using a rotating drum mechanism similar to a revolver cylinder. That means a Virginia-class submarine's 4 torpedo tubes could ripple fire 37 torpedoes in under a minute. China's submarine force, built around Soviet-inspired designs that emphasize single, powerful weapons, has no answer for this. Their Type 039 and Type 093 submarines carry between 14 and 20 torpedoes total. A single Virginia could launch twice that number from just its torpedo tubes, while keeping heavyweight Mark 48s in reserve for capital ship. But the Navy isn't stopping there. The Block V Virginias, with their Virginia payload module, add 4 large tubes, each originally designed for 7 Tomahawk cruise missiles. These tubes could, in theory, be retrofitted with CRAW launchers, holding up to 20 mini-torpedoes each. That's 80 additional weapons without sacrificing any traditional torpedo capacity. Combined with the original proposal for a modified torpedo room loadout, which suggests 160 CRAWs plus 10 Mark 48s in the same space that normally holds 26 heavyweights, a single submarine could carry 250 torpedoes. The logistics advantages are staggering. CRAWs use the same fire control systems as existing torpedoes, just with modified software. They're maintained using the same equipment, stored in the same magazines, and loaded through the same hatches. The Navy doesn't need new submarine tenders, new training facilities, or new weapons depots. Everything integrates with the infrastructure built over 50 years of submarine operations. And for that, each submarine is now capable of engaging with multiple targets with practically the same accuracy and with much higher chances of penetrating through defenses and interceptions. But while submarines are trying to use more weapons to enhance their first strike capabilities from the shadows, another system aims to simulate entire fleets to overwhelm the opposing detection systems and prompt a quick surrender. The Nemesis, an acronym for Netted Emulation of Multi-Element Signature Against Integrated Sensors. Nemesis was developed from over 15 years of black budget research that's now only coming to light. The program's roots likely trace back to studies on how modern naval radars process information. As it turns out, advanced radars don't just look for metal objects, they analyze dozens of characteristics like motion patterns, electromagnetic emissions, and even wake turbulence. This meant traditional decoys that just reflected radar waves became increasingly useless against modern threat. Nemesis took a radically different approach. Instead of hiding ships or confusing radars, it created completely false naval forces that are indistinguishable from real ones. The first appearance of the Nemesis system itself in US government files was way back in 2013, when the Navy described it as a system of systems to coordinate distributed electronic warfare resources against many adversary surveillance and targeting sensors. In translation, the Nemesis was initially posited as a system that would work on any radar or detector oriented toward incoming US Navy forces. The actual content and the suggestions of the system would, however, remain relatively tight-lipped for several years. It's only in 2024 that we see the first proposals for implementing a system that should work in the Nemesis umbrella through the LEAD, Long Endurance Electronic Decoy. The LEAD system reportedly consists of small unmanned aircraft that fly predetermined patterns while broadcasting sophisticated electronic signatures. But calling them decoys undersells their capability. Each lead drone carries multiple RF transmitters that simulate everything from the radar return of a destroyer's superstructure to the electromagnetic noise of its engines and electronics. They fly at wave-top height at 30 to 35 knots, which are typical destroyer speeds, and can maintain their headings for over 10 hours. But the secret sauce is the ability to network. Using a mesh network, multiple lead drones could coordinate their movements to maintain proper fleet spacing and formation. They can accelerate and turn together, maintaining the illusion even under close observation. 12 drones can simulate an entire destroyer squadron, complete with picket ships, plane guards, and formation changes. China's entire anti-access aerial denial strategy depends on long-range targeting. The DF-21D carrier killer missile relies on satellite reconnaissance and over-the-horizon radar to find American carriers. But if sensors show multiple carrier groups, which one do you shoot? If China only has enough missiles for one salvo, it likely won't rush to strike at false targets, giving the US more options to approach for their own standoff operations. The integration with existing fleet operations is seamless. Lead drones launch from the same rails used for target drones on destroyers and cruisers. They're controlled through the same combat systems that manage other unmanned assets. Most importantly, they can mix with real ships, so 3 destroyers and 9 lead drones could create the impression of a 12-ship surface action group. Budget documents from fiscal year 2025 show the Navy purchasing 120 lead systems at roughly $3 million each, which is pocket change compared to the billion-dollar ships they protect. But the program is expanding beyond simple ship imitation. Next-generation lead variants under development could simulate aircraft formation, submarine signatures, and even the acoustic and thermal signatures of nuclear reactors. The Navy's betting that in future conflicts, the first battle won't be between ships and missiles, but between reality and deception. And speaking of drone improvements, the Navy destroyers are getting a leg up in the drone warfare designs with the Roadrunner M from Anduril. One of the premises that drove this development was, what if interceptors weren't actually single use? The development was shockingly fast by defense standards. Anduril leveraged commercial drone technology, off-the-shelf jet engines from the model aircraft industry, and software architecture from Silicon Valley, rather than traditional defense contractors. The prototype flew in 2021. By 2024, Special Operations Command was conducting combat trials. In March 2025, the Navy had declared that the Roadrunner system would be one of the options for integration onto Arleigh Burke destroyers that follow the Gerald R. Ford-class carriers on patrol missions around the world. The drone's development cycle would be miles ahead of traditional US procurement. The genius is in the simplicity. The Roadrunner M uses 2 turbojet engines, particularly designed to allow for the vertical launch and recovery system. According to Anduril, the engine's thrust-to-weight ratio is practically unparalleled. Of course, the key here is the weapon's ability to intercept a missile or a swarm of drones using a contact detonation warhead that creates a wider area of effect. In theory, the system should be able to take out multiple drones or missiles that are moving close together. But the kicker here is the drone's ability to return if it doesn't get used. Simply put, if the detection systems fail to properly lock onto a viable target, or the targets disappear before the Roadrunner can maneuver into them, the autonomous navigation will lead the drone back to its launching pad, where it can land and get refueled for its next mission. Notably, the Interceptor still destroys itself on a successful hit, much like traditional anti-air designs such as the Patriot-compatible missiles. However, the key here is the economics. Anduril has suggested that each Roadrunner costs only low six figures, which is supposed to be much lower than comparable contemporary anti-aircraft and missile interceptors that the US Armed Forces had previously had access to. Each SM-2 missile costs $2 million, a rolling airframe missile costs $900,000. Even the cheap ESSM runs $1.5 million per shot. If the Roadrunner lowers the production cost to $200,000 and adds a layer of redundancy by being recoverable if it misses, it could be obtained in much larger numbers to allow for a more comprehensive defensive system. And the numbers are what's going to matter in the end. A Burke-class destroyer carries 96 vertical launch cells. Let's suppose half are loaded with defensive missiles. A single missile or a drone swarm targeting the carrier group might require launching multiple interceptors to destroy them. This brings down the number of possible interceptions to a few dozen at best. But with the Roadrunner M, as soon as the threat is removed, the additional drones can simply get refueled and slotted back into the ship's launcher. This practically ensures that the system can fend off as many targets as it has interceptors. Now, last but not least is the proposal to revive a project that's been deemed a failure, the USS Zumwalt. These multi-billion-dollar destroyers were initially supposed to be scrapped as their costs severely overran the budget, but the Navy decided to make a radical decision in 2021. It would rip out the advanced gun systems and install the ability to launch a new class of hypersonic missiles, the conventional prompt strike weapons. The weapon's history reaches back to 2003, when DARPA began the Falcon program, exploring whether America could strike anywhere on Earth in under an hour without using nuclear weapons. The Army picked up the research in 2011 with the Advanced Hypersonic Weapon Program, conducting the first successful flight from Hawaii to Kwajalein Atoll. The results were impressive, as the missile covered 2,300 miles in less than 30 minutes. The Navy joined the program in 2018, but with a crucial difference. While the Army focused on truck-mounted launchers for island bases, the Navy wanted to launch from ships and submarines. This required solving unprecedented engineering challenges. Hypersonic weapons generate temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Launching them from a ship's vertical cells, surrounded by other weapons and fuel, seemed impossibly dangerous. The solution came from an unlikely source: NASA's Space Shuttle program. Lockheed Martin's engineers adapted heat-resistant materials originally developed for the shuttle's cargo bay to line the Zumwalt's new weapon cells. The Zumwalt's launch tubes, originally designed for the Cancel Advanced Gun Systems ammunition, would be retrofitted to allow them to receive and launch CPS missiles. The CPS is encounterable with current technology because it's not a ballistic missile that follows a predictable arc through space. After the boost phase, the hypersonic glide vehicle separates at around 100,000 feet and begins its unpowered glide at speeds exceeding Mach 5. But unlike a ballistic warhead that follows gravity, the wedge-shaped glider can perform banking turns, pull-up maneuvers, and even reverse course. And instead of high-yield explosives, CPS uses tungsten kinetic penetrators, essentially a hypersonic hammer that destroys targets through pure kinetic energy. And Mach 5, a tungsten rod carries the same energy per kilogram as TNT, but concentrated into a tiny impact area. It can pierce through underground bunkers and hardened aircraft shelters, as well as carry a flight deck. Then the explosive payload aboard the missile can finish the job. The June 2024 tests from Hawaii to the Marshall Islands demonstrated just how effective the weapon is at high ranges, reportedly striking within 6 feet of its intended target after traveling over 2,000 miles. That's accurate enough to hit a specific building in Beijing launched from a submarine near Guam. And the Navy is not simply banking on the few Zumwalts it has. While each Zumwalt will carry 12 CPS missiles, Virginia Block V submarines are expected to carry 4 in the near future. But the real force multiplier comes from the joint program with the Army, as the system is also being developed for truck-mounted launchers. This shares development costs, combines production runs, and allows for a better supply of components and replacement parts, which ultimately means both services get more weapons for less money. When put together, these 5 weapons create an interlocking web of defensive and offensive capabilities that propelled the US Navy's operational capacities beyond what was previously imaginable. Picture this scenario. A carrier strike group approaches the South China Sea. Lead drones spread out ahead, creating false signatures of additional ships. Chinese satellites and radars see what appears to be 3 carrier groups instead of 1. Super Hornets launch from the real carrier, each carrying AIM-174Bs that can engage Chinese fighters before they even take off from mainland bases or destroy incoming missiles that the Chinese army has decided to use. The fighters don't need to get close, as they're receiving targeting data from an E-2D Hawkeye that itself protected by Roadrunner M's cycling through defensive patrols. Below the surface, Virginia submarines slip through Chinese submarine patrol areas, each carrying enough Craw torpedoes to engage entire ship and submarine squadrons while saving their Mark 48s for when the aircraft carriers arrive with support. If Chinese commanders order their surface fleet to engage, they face a terrible choice: spread out to avoid submarine attack and become vulnerable to CPS strikes from Zumwalts, or concentrate for mutual defense and risk losing multiple ships to a single hypersonic impact. The integration with existing Pacific infrastructure makes this especially potent. The US already has multiple bases surrounding the South China Sea, including several in allied countries like South Korea, Japan, and Singapore. The Marine Corps is being fully retooled to provide littoral combat and aerial denial capability. The US Air Force is slowly deploying the B-21 stealth bomber and next-generation F-47 fighter jets, which promise even better range and weapon capabilities. China's counter strategies all hit fundamental problems. They can't match the AIM-174B's range without completely redesigning their aircraft and missiles. They can't overwhelm Roadrunner defenses without building more drones than their industry can produce. They can't find the real ships among the lead decoys without getting close enough to be vulnerable. They can't stop CPS missiles with current technology, and they can't match the Craw's numbers without redesigning their entire submarine force. And these weapons are coming just in time. Most analysts suggest that 2027 will be the year with the biggest risk so far for a broader Taiwan conflict that could drag the US into a war with China. By that time, all 5 systems should at least be partially operational and tested for efficiency. The Pacific Fleet will have hundreds of AIM-174Bs, thousands of Craws, dozens of CPS missiles, and enough lead and Roadrunner systems to protect every high-value unit. China's window of opportunity, if it ever existed, is rapidly closing. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn more about the Air Force's developments, check out our previous video on the F-47. And stay tuned to the Military Show for daily videos on weapons reshaping the balance of power in the Pacific and developments that impact global geopolitics.